Okay, thanks a lot. I think I can stand on Julie O'Neill's shoulders and be a little more detailed about some things. Maybe I should say one thing ahead of time, which builds on Jürgen Gebhardt. I come out of a country that doesn't know the doctrine of sovereignty in parliament, but that has been federal for a long time in one way or another. So we have learned to live with either no sovereignty or limited sovereignty, or however you relativize sovereignty, for centuries. And I think several countries in Europe, like Austria, have somewhat similar experiences. Some countries, like Britain, have totally different experiences. And maybe sort of to become part of a supranational enterprise is a learning experience that takes a few decades and maybe a century for some countries. I am in the Lafan box, and I will end up in functional federalism box 3. And I start with a quotation, and maybe this quotation reveals some of the spirit. It's by a Swiss novelist giving a speech in the old German Parliament building in Bonn on Unification Day, and he says, "I'm wishing for a transformation that will turn the crisis headwind into a tailwind for the next qualitative leap in European policy, like what we saw with German unification in 1989. It remains to be seen what form of statehood this model might take. We'll experience it when we accomplish it." So it's learning by doing. There is no, we don't know what's on the other side of the river. We have to swim across. Otherwise we won't find out. I'm having 6 points. I hope I can make them all. First is on the nation state, and I think there is an important issue there which I want to raise, at least for Europe. It is an important issue that there has taken place in the 1950s and 60s, if not earlier, something that I call the indissoluble wedding of capitalism and social security. And the next point I'm going to make is, can it consummate the marriage, Europe? Can you reproduce this marriage at the European level? Because if you can't, you're going to have a permanent integration problem. And at least in a real common market, you will have a permanent integration problem. Third point, a cautionary tale, marriage American style, which is where I don't want to see Europe going. I'd rather have it a European style marriage. And then the homegrown European approach, social Europe. It all hangs on currency union, you'll see. And then I'll make some points, but probably I'll leave those out, saying that social Europe isn't all we need. You can't have an integrated Europe if you don't have functioning nation states and functioning national bureaucracies, like in Greece. I mean, even the old Europe presupposed that you had something on the ground. Okay. And then I could go back to the US. I mean, the US were already 13 states, colonies, which existed for 100 and so years, so there was already a pre-established situation. It wasn't just fresh. And one could learn something from them, but we talked about that yesterday. Maybe we don't need to talk about it today. So the first thing I want to say is we are living, we should look at 4 phases that we are in. The first globalization, 1870s to 1914. And in the first globalization actually is different from the second globalization in the fact that there is free mobility of persons in the first globalization, which we don't have in the second. In the second we have free mobility of goods, of capital, of services, but not of people, except in the European Union. So the European Union, in a sense, is a repeat of the first phase of globalization within one area of the globe. And then we have, which is also important, half a century of protectionism, closed nation states, closed political systems, for about 50 to 60 years, which shows you that globalization isn't natural, and common markets aren't natural. They have to be politically built, and they have to be politically stabilized, otherwise they fall apart. And this is a permanent memory of that fact, and Europe can fall apart. Other things like NAFTA can also fall apart, and the global market can also fall apart. It fell apart in a few days in August of 1914 for 60 years. And now we have a game changer in the 1950s, which actually has to do with what we are talking about, universalizing the welfare state in Western Europe and the United States. The United States later, after Nixon departed from that road. But in my mind, building the welfare state in the 1950s was about undoing protectionism, because then you had a mechanism there that did protect differently than by tariffs. So you could lower tariffs, you could integrate Europe because you had a welfare state. So sort of the welfare state was an integrative factor because it lowered the pressure for protectionism and made Europe as an integrated common market possible. And you might add, which I don't have on the slide, but following the earlier talk, you might add as a big game changer the euro as a game changer in the European construction. But that's sort of, now this is sort of a thing I just want to show you, because it is basically expressing, as far as my first point is concerned, the situation we emotionally seem to feel in many places. It is a cartoon done as an oil painting in 2001, and it's called On Course, which is an ironic remark about the Treaty of Nice, because it isn't on course. You have all these people in the boat. Nobody is really rowing. It is being drifting by the currents. You have the stars, the 12 stars of Europe. Already more than half have fallen into the water. You have one person beating up other persons who you can decide who that person is. And basically this is something that in the treaty that describes the situation in 2001 viewed from somebody who wants more integration and feels totally dissatisfied with the state of the union. And I think that does reflect the standpoint of quite a few people, not just in Germany. And I thought this a potent image of what we're into. And I think maybe to return to the image also suggests there is a storm coming and we aren't ready for it. And now the storm has come, and the question is, can we get ready for it? So I'm going into some other roads than my earlier contributors up here have gone into. I'm going sort of beyond the nation state in Europe and saying the nation state is, the shells are still there, but it has outlived its functionality. I'm saying, like an ellipse, European integration requires by definition two carefully balanced foci: market integration and social integration, not just market integration. No building can be stable on the long run if it is just built around market integration. It will be blown away by the forces of protectionism at the first great conflict. So without them, it flies apart. And now I want to remind you, especially you Europeans, but everybody else in the room too, the first of a process where we thought about this for the first time and saw a bit more than we did see in 1990, when we were forced by German unification to act fast. The first plan for a European monetary union based on the experience of other unified currencies in the world in earlier historical periods required the union to take up 5 to 8% of the European GNP, so it would be a buffer from crisis and market swings. So the people in the Marshall report and then the McDougall report said we can't have a currency union without a somewhat stronger center that works as a buffer. Otherwise, the first crisis will throw the currency union to the ground. And the European Union has 1% only of Europe's GNP, as it did back then in the 1970s, more or less. It's 1 point something. And it is confronted, and that is different maybe from China and many Asian states, it is confronted with nation states or with member states that have 50% of their GNPs at their national disposal in terms of the public sphere, in terms of the GDP. So you have a very small Europe confronting a comparatively large, economically large nation state. And the idea was, if you don't go up to 5 or 8%, a currency union cannot last. So basically, I think if these guys were right, we are at a much larger crossing point than most people think we are, because we have to somehow get there. We have to somehow improve the buffer function of the European Union. Otherwise, our currency will fall apart. And then I think if the currency union falls apart, much of the European Union will also fall apart, because it's not so easy to go a step backward without affecting all other steps. It is much easier to go a step forward in that respect than to unwind. Now, what this implies, this 5 to 8% idea, this is something you probably all know, at least the Europeans will know it, the European banana concept. This is supposed to be the region in Europe that is very productive and wealthy. It goes down to northern Italy, probably in the meantime it goes over to Catalonia. Maybe it's more a boomerang than a banana in the meantime. But if that's Europe, if this is the rich region and much of the rest is periphery, then this implies also a notion about distribution and redistribution. And I think if Europe doesn't get redistributive, if Europe only saves banks and not people, it will not last. Especially if it saves banks only in the long run. I mean, you can do it once, you can do it for a year or two, but if you do it for 20 years, you will be seen as just a bank saving agency and not a construction that is relevant to the people. Okay, now let me get into the cautionary tale. I think if you look at the US, this is one direction Europe can take. And this direction you've seen in the US since the 1970s, playing out, thinning out the middle class, increasing class polarization, devolution of risk from central to state level, which means in Europe from nation-state level to department or local level, privatization of social security, rise of protectionism. You've seen that rise in terms of right parties. You've seen increased political polarization, also in Europe, not just in the US. And you've seen something which makes Europe very similar to the US. What happened in the US after the 1970s is that the New Deal got frozen, and you have sort of an anti-discrimination litigation state growing, where the state doesn't pay anything anymore in pensions, etc., but it says you go to court and get your employer and get some damages, and this is large. If you add the amounts of money spent on the litigation state to the welfare state in the US, you get sums spent that are much larger than Europe spends on welfare states on the average. It's a quite... So if Europe doesn't want to go there, it has to go towards a way in which these two wedding rings, on the one side there's a euro in it, and on the other side there is sort of a question mark in it, where it has to fill the other side. It has to construct a social Europe. Now, I think if you look back to the start, 1955 to 1957, you already see the lightening of it, because France wanted European integration only if there could be a European welfare state. It wanted its French model to be the European model. Now, France didn't quite succeed. It lost 80% and won 20%, because there are some phrases in the European Treaty back then which date to French, sort of about gender equality and several other things which date to this French model. And I think this conflict has been permanent, and this conflict is now moving up to the European level in a permanent fashion because of the crisis crossroads. Once you supranationalize the currency union and have a common currency, then certain mechanisms which allow you as a nation state to deal with these crises don't exist anymore. We talked about that yesterday. And therefore, if you keep supranationalizing currency, bank, and fiscal policy, you must also find a way to reinsure the welfare states at the supranational level. And about reinsure, let me just say that Marjolin report, at the time it was issued, said we should have a European unemployment insurance, and it should be a reinsurance of national unemployment insurances. It should look like the US unemployment insurance, where in areas of large unemployment, Europe refunds part of what is paid, so that it is seen as a Europe that saves the people and not just the banks. I mean, that's my saying, not them. Okay, and I think without such supranationalization, you will have a Europe that slides back into blocks, protectionist blocks, and is falling apart in that direction. Now, this expectation of Europe has always been there. This is a cartoon from 1981, when François Mitterrand tried to extend his projet social to all of Europe, and he didn't succeed. And this is a cartoon saying sort of economic crisis, unemployment, East-West crisis, Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Schmidt blocking him. So the idea to supranationalize this in one way or another has always been there, and there have always been national expectations of some to do so. Okay, I don't want to say much about this. I think you need a functioning state machinery and bureaucracy on the ground in places like Greece and Italy to make Europe work anyhow, and to make a social Europe work especially, because otherwise it will all just end up in corruption. And I think we had a much better situation for establishing this before 2007, because Greece and Italy expected Europe to help them out of their national dilemmas in terms of having a not so good political system, whereas now we have a much more complicated situation. Okay, now basically I can end with this citation by a US Supreme Court judge in 1947, who goes back to 1789, when he says, "So by a stroke as bold as it proved successful, they founded a nation." They founded a Europe, you'd have to say, in 1957. Although they had set out only to find a way to reduce trade restrictions. So also they solved the particular problem causative of their historic action by introducing the Commerce Clause in the new structure of power. And I think in terms of having a central court, in terms of having a Commerce Clause, and in terms of having sort of nation states on the ground, those were the colonial 13 structures on the ground, which were different, sure. We have a similar situation, and we have to make something of it in our open-ended projects. Surely the nation states and their shells are still a problem, but I think everybody knows if we return to square one in 1956, we would get nowhere. We could just as well pack up and go hiding. So this is where I'll end with a cartoon. This is a cartoon from 1952 about Europe wasn't even there yet. It was a steel and coal community. Here is the United States watching over Europe, wanting it to unite after the Marshall Plan. And here is Germany. The Germans always think of themselves as der Deutsche Michel, the German Michael, and the French Marianne. Probably that's her somewhere here. And the Deutsche Michel, in terms of a woman, which is unusual, says, "But I want a lifeboat for myself in the united Europe. I want to be sovereign." And so the problem is old, even in Germany, but I think the solution is now closer to, is in sight, because we have already supranationalized certain parts of national policy which were always national, like currency, fiscal, etc., etc. And let me end, maybe, I think it's also a Chinese saying that somebody told me, but I don't have the Chinese letters for it, and it says something like, "We need to swim across the river to find the stone." And we don't know the stone yet. First we need to swim, and then we will find the stone. And I think that's the European situation right now, and I hope we'll find a sensible stone.
Okay, thank you much. And we now have